In the final years of the Cold War, somewhere in the endless Siberian expanse, a Soviet military unit encountered something that defied their understanding of warfare and of reality itself. The year was believed to be 1989. The location, a remote military training ground, unmarked on public maps, far from cities and prying eyes. Official records remain elusive, and names of personnel were either scrubbed from the documents or never recorded at all. But according to a leaked CIA translation of a KGB intelligence file, something extraordinary happened there. It began during a routine military exercise. A unit of Soviet soldiers, at least 23 of them, was engaged in field maneuvers when a disc-shaped craft appeared low above the trees. The object was described as silent, metallic, roughly 9 meters in diameter, and hovering in a fixed position, unaffected by wind or movement below. The soldiers hesitated only briefly before opening fire. Some reports suggest they used shoulder-launched missiles. Others say it was a more coordinated ground-to-air battery. Either way, the projectile found its mark. The disc was hit. It spiraled, lost altitude, and crashed into a nearby clearing. Smoke billowed from the impact zone. Then, the unexpected happened. From the wreckage emerged 5 small humanoid figures. No more than 3 or 4 feet tall, their heads were disproportionately large, with dark, insect-like eyes. They wore close-fitting metallic suits that shimmered with movement, and their gait was unnatural, silent, gliding, almost mechanical. The soldiers advanced cautiously, weapons raised. The entities grouped together tightly, standing shoulder to shoulder in a loose semicircle, and then, without warning, they changed. The 5 figures seemed to merge into one, a single spherical mass of pulsing light, roughly the size of a human torso. The air around it buzzed, and then came the flash. It wasn't an explosion in the conventional sense. There was no heat, no fire, no shockwave, just an overwhelming burst of white light. In under 2 seconds, it was over, and 23 soldiers had been turned to stone, literally transformed into a chalky, pale substance resembling calcite or fossilized bone. They stood as if frozen in motion, some reaching forward, others mid-step, preserved in horrifying clarity. 2 soldiers survived. They'd taken temporary shelter behind a concrete bunker on the perimeter of the field and were partially shielded from the effect. Their reports would later become the basis of the investigation. When Soviet intelligence arrived at the scene, they imposed an immediate lockdown. Photographs were taken, samples were collected, the petrified remains of the soldiers were transported to a classified research facility near Moscow. In the weeks that followed, a full forensic analysis was allegedly carried out. According to the leaked translation of the KGB report, the biological structure of the bodies had been fundamentally altered on a molecular level, no longer organic, no longer human. The cause of the transformation was unknown. No radiation was detected. No chemical residue was found. There was no trace of the crashed craft. If wreckage had been recovered, it was never acknowledged. This event would have remained buried in Soviet archives, another Cold War secret among thousands, were it not for the collapse of the USSR. In 1993, a Ukrainian newspaper published a brief but explosive article about the incident. The story was picked up by a Canadian tabloid, which sensationalized the headline, but somewhere along the way, a copy of the original KGB file, or a summary of it, was translated and submitted to the CIA. The CIA's official stance was cautious, but one internal memo, attached to the case file, contained a chilling note. If the contents of this report reflect actual events, the implications are disturbing. The entities, if real, demonstrate a defensive capability far beyond our current understanding. They are not simply observers. They are capable of decisive and lethal retaliation. Among UFO researchers, the case remains controversial. The lack of physical evidence, the anonymous sourcing, the geopolitical context, it all raises questions. Was it a misidentified weapons test, Soviet psyops, disinformation planted for Western intelligence? Still, the core of the story holds: a Soviet unit fired upon an unknown aerial object. Something responded, and 23 trained soldiers, armed and alert, were eliminated without a shot being returned. The two survivors never spoke publicly. Their names remain unknown. Their fate undocumented. But according to the CIA summary, the KGB closed the investigation quietly. No blame was assigned. No further study was requested. The file was marked classified and shelved until someone, years later, let it slip. What made this incident different from others buried in Cold War secrecy was the timing. The Soviet Union was collapsing. Archives once sealed under threat of imprisonment were suddenly vulnerable to theft, bribery, or exposure by disillusioned insiders. The leak came in pieces. First, a short column in Ternopil Vechurny, a small Ukrainian-language newspaper, then an article in a Canadian tabloid citing anonymous sources. The KGB file allegedly contained more: photographs, autopsy reports, and metallurgical analysis, but none of that has ever been publicly released. Only the summary remains, and with it, the mystery. If the event occurred, it stands as one of the most violent confrontations between humans and an unknown intelligence in modern history. There are echoes of the Siberian case in other lesser-known reports. In 1986, a Soviet mining engineer in the Kola Peninsula claimed to witness an object crash near a borehole site. Radiation spikes followed. The area was cordoned off. Workers reported the melting of equipment without heat. In 1978, a Soviet radar station near Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky reported tracking an object traveling at hypersonic speed, then hovering motionless before disappearing. Soldiers who approached the last known location described tissue vibration and nausea as if exposed to a non-audible pressure wave. In each of these cases, documentation is partial. Testimonies are fragmented, but patterns emerge: non-ballistic movement, interaction with military installations, and unexplained effects on biological systems. The Soviet stone soldiers case remains the most extreme. It suggests not only the presence of an advanced non-human intelligence, but a response protocol, a threshold, a consequence. There's also the question of the beings themselves. The description, small stature, large heads, black eyes, matches what is commonly referred to in UFO literature as the Greys. But their behavior, particularly the merging into a radiant sphere, deviates from known patterns. Some suggest these were not biological entities at all, but biomechanical probes, possibly autonomous, possibly controlled remotely. The act of fusion might have triggered a failsafe, a last resort countermeasure, not an attack, a self-defense mechanism. What happened that day in Siberia may never be fully known, but if even a fraction of the story is true, it forces us to ask, how far have others come while we were still learning to look up?